Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at round number 6 of the Grand Swiss, which is being held here in the Isle of Man, which is a crown dependency of the United Kingdom. Now, I've been on a big heater coming into the 6th round after drawing my first 2 games and getting off to a slow start. I've won 3 in a row, and I've vaulted my way all the way to the top of the standings. And today, I'm playing as my co-leader and a very familiar face in Andrei Esipenko from Russia. Now, those of you guys who are following chess in 2022, when I started my comeback to chess over the board after nearly 3 years of not playing, I think it was something like 830 days, I actually had to play against Andrei Esipenko in the FIDE Grand Prix, which was held in Berlin, Germany. Now, there was a very fateful game, the 6th game of the bracket stage in the first event in Berlin, where I needed to draw Andrei to move on to the knockout portion, and we played a very interesting game. It was very, very complex. I was a little bit worse. Somewhere around move 40, I made a huge blunder, and I was simply lost after the first time control. However, I was able to come away with a great escape. I kept defending tenaciously. I was able to survive and get a miraculous draw after a 7-hour game. I would move on to the knockout stage where I would eventually win the entire event. In the 3rd Grand Prix, I would also finish in the semifinals. And those 2 results vaulted me into the FIDE Candidates Tournament. So we're back at it again. Andrei with the white pieces, and he starts with e4 just like he did in the previous 2 times that we played where he had the white pieces. So I go c5, we get knight to f3, and now I play this move g6. Now, g6 is what is known as the hyper-accelerated dragon. Normally, black plays move order knight c6, d4, takes, and g6, and this is what is considered the standard accelerated dragon. But by omitting the move knight c6 and going g6, this is what we call the hyper-accelerated dragon. Now, this is not an opening that I've ever played before, so it surely caught my opponent by surprise at least a little bit. But Andrei has his own surprise ready when he plays the move c3, and now I play the move d5, and here he goes e5. Now, if Andrei were to trade on d5 after takes d4, bishop g7, this, of course, would be a transposition back into my game from the 2nd round against Raunak Sadhwani from India, which was a draw. So, Andrei has a little surprise with e5, but now I return the favor with this move a6, which stops the move bishop b5. Now, here he goes d4. Now, you may be wondering why not knight c6. The problem with knight c6 is that after white plays bishop b5, let's say bishop g7, d4, a6, takes, and knight bd2, black has serious problems with this right triangle box of pawns on the queen side. For example, say I play a move like knight h6, there's knight b3, takes, and castles. After bishop e3, followed by rook to c1, or even potentially ideas like knight c5, white is simply doing very, very well because of this pawn structure. So, I play a6 to stop bishop b5, we get d4, knight c6, and now he plays h3. Now, it's kind of funny because h3 does stop bishop g4, all the while white can't play bishop b5, so we're basically offsetting each other's bishop's ideas of pinning these 2 horses. So now I go bishop g7, we get bishop e2, and here I play the move f6. Now, you might be wondering, what is this f6 move? It looks ridiculous. You're pushing your f-pawn. But the big issue for me here is that, first of all, white has the classic connect 5, but secondarily, how do I develop this knight to castle the king out of the center of the board? Now, I could play a move like knight h6, but after d takes c5 here, it's not really clear how black will win this pawn on e5, and the knight on h6 is always under pressure from this bishop on c1. So I go f6 here, and now Andrei has to trade the pawns because he castles. I can take on e5, take it all off, and I have an extra pawn on e7. So he has to take on f6, but now I can go knight takes f6. I finish my development here by castling my king on the next turn. So we get castles. I decide to castle my king here, and now he decides to play this move, bishop to e3. Now, in my preparation before the game, I had actually looked at similar positions to this, where white takes the pawn on c5, and after a move like e5, bishop e3, bishop e6, let's say white were to play a move like knight bd2, which looks very natural. This actually loses, because after d4, takes, bishop g5, d3, black will win this bishop on e2 because it is trapped. So I have looked at dc5, and I think Andrei knew this because in this position, when he castled, I was moving instantly up to this point, but now I used a couple of minutes before castling because obviously I'd looked at dc5. So I castle, and he plays bishop to e3, realizing, of course, that he takes on c5. I will go e5, and I'm most likely back in my preparation. So he goes bishop e3, and now I decide to take the pawn. Now, this was a very tough situation in terms of what to do here because I have so many options. Now, I knew that d takes c5 was always an idea, but the problem is, how do I induce d takes c5 while improving my position? Now, I did consider moves like knight to h5, let's say d takes c5, and something like e5 here, and this probably is okay with the idea of knight f4, but there are even moves like bishop g5, which somewhat complicate matters. So, at the end of the day, I decide to take on d4, and the reason is simply I'm getting tired of having to figure out what to do with this pawn. I don't want it to be thinking about whether to trade or leave the pawn here for the next 5 to 10 moves. So I decided to trade, get it over with, and now the structure very much stabilizes here. There are no more real pawn breaks or trades. For example, even here after, say, king h8, at some point white could maybe even go c4, exploding this box of pawns. So I trade, I go knight to h5 here, trying to put my knife on f4, and now we get the move rook to e1. I play knight f4, and bishop f1 is played by Andre. Now, if Andre were to play bishop takes knight here, after rook takes f4, this is very seriously dangerous for white, because the pawn on d4 can no longer be guarded here, and so white definitely needs to keep this bishop to guard the central pawn. So Andre plays bishop f1, and now I play this very enterprising move g5. Now, g5 is a move that I played after a little bit of a think, and the reason was simply, why not? Now, computer actually thinks g5 is the best move, and I'm very proud that I found this move simply because what else can I do? The big issue I have here is that I can never really play e5 and build a big black center, because after takes, for example, takes, and knight c3, I have this very weak pawn on d5. If I ever play d4 here, for example, white can trade the bishops and play knight to e4 here, and white is simply a little bit better with this knight in the center of the board, and the fact that this pawn on d4 can be blockaded quite easily. So, I played g5, and there are a few reasons that I played this move. First of all is that white has played this move h3, which stops bishop g4. So if white were to play a move like knight c3, now I can go g4, attacking the knight. If white trades on g4, suddenly the pin is very much back in play. My rook on f8 is perfectly placed, the bishop, the knight, all my pieces are coming to the party. So white doesn't really want to allow g4. So the other obvious move that white has is knight takes pawn. That's a free pawn. Why not take? But if white takes the pawn, now I can play e5, building the big black center here, and I create a fossil by attacking the knight on g5 at the same time. So here white would have to play knight to f3, but now after e4 attacking the knight, let's say white goes knight h2, I can even play a move like knight e6 here, trying to win this pawn on d4, and after knight c3, let's just say knight d4, queen d2, bishop e6, rook a d1, for example. Now I can play a move like queen f6, followed by rook d8, maybe queen g6, and with these pawns in the center, both of the bishops active, and these knights in the center of the board, the position is simply overwhelming for black. So, after I played g5, and as Andre was using over 20 minutes on this move, I started to become very, very confident because we're only on move number 13 here. My opponent's down to 40 minutes, which means he essentially has 40 minutes for 27 moves, so there's very likely going to be a time scramble situation. Now, to his credit, Andre finds what I think is probably the only move for a human to not lose the game here, which is this great move, knight to e5. Now, chess.com doesn't give this an exclam or double exclam, but for me, this move is what saved the game. I think if Andre had played any other move, there's a very, very good chance that I would have won the game. Now, the reason knight e5 is such a good move is that it stops all my ideas with g4, first of all. I can no longer play for g4. I can no longer play for e5 either, so I have to take, and now I decide to take the pawn here, and he goes knight to c3, and while I'm up a pawn in the center of the board, I push this pawn to g5. It's a little bit weak, and can I really keep the pawns in the center intact? So after knight c3, I play e6. Now, to be clear, one of the reasons that I decided to just take on e5 and take everything off is that I felt that if I played something like the computer line with bishop f5 here, I thought that after takes, knight d2, knight f3, knight d4, if anybody is better, it can be white, and I don't really see how black can be better, so why do I want to play a position where I might be suffering, and my opponent is the only one with winning chances? So if I decide to go for it with bishop takes e5, if I lose, I lose, obviously. If I miss something, so be it. But I feel like if I'm right and I calculate correctly, I will have counter chances to try and win the game as well. So we get knight to c3. I play e6 to guard the pawn in the center. Really the only move I can play here, if I play a move like, let's just say bishop f5, white can trade the bishops on bishop for the knight on f4, take on d5, and now the bishops look pretty, but they're not really doing a whole lot. This pawn on g5 is really weak here. I push it in front of the king. I never should have done that, and now the knight has all these great targets on f4 and e7. So, I play e6 to guard the pawn on d5 against this capture where now it's not possible. We get bishop to c5, attacking the rook and attacking my bishop at the same time. So I play bishop d6, and now the queen guards the bishop. We get bishop d4, and here I play the move knight g6. Now already here, I thought I was okay still, but I feel like I have to be very, very careful. So I play, let's just say, a random move like b5, for example. I think after g3, knight g6, and bishop g2, suddenly there are all kinds of threats here towards the pawn on e6, the pawn on d5 as well, and I have to be very, very careful. Now the computer says after bishop e7, I guess queen h5 and bishop f6, maybe black's okay, maybe, although probably not. But even beyond that, if I play just say a random move like, I don't know, rook b8, for example, where I can sack the knight for the pawn on d5 and look at these bishops, the classic double wooden shield in the middle of the board, and white is simply completely winning here. Now the reason is if I play rook f7, for example, white can take, and now white can go queen to b3 check, king to f8, and now white has queen f3, king g8, queen d5, king f8, bishop c5, followed by rook to d1, and I will lose some material. So I play knight g6 to stop this g3 idea, because if white goes g3 now, I can push p with e5, building the big black center, and I'm very much back in the game. Now, what's amazing about this position is actually computer says white can just take the pawn, and after takes, queen d4, due to the weak king here on g with ideas like bishop c4 potentially here, white is actually completely fine. So Andre instead plays knight to a4 here, trying to go for knight b6 or knight c5. It's also worth pointing out that if I were to, say, be able to finish my development, for example, by getting this rook to c8, I would almost certainly win the game. So he tries to take advantage of the lack of development on the queen side with knight to a4, but now I have this move bishop c7, stopping knight b6, but also very important because if I were to play e5 here, white can play bishop b6, attacking the queen, and when I move my queen, white takes the pawn, and now with the weaknesses in the center on g5 and e5, white is simply much better. So I play bishop c7, which stops knight b6, but also now if white just say plays a3, after e5, there's no bishop b6 anymore, and now the central pawns are rolling. So we get bishop to d3 here, and now I play this move e5. It's not a move that I necessarily wanted to play, but I didn't see a better alternative. And after e5, Andre takes this knight on g6, pretty much the only move. If white plays, say, bishop e3, for example, now I can go e4, bishop f1, and now I think after queen d6, g3, for example, there's like rook f5, knight e5, knight f3, and black is completely winning. So Andre takes the knight, and now I have to take the bishop on d4. If I take this one, white takes the pawn, and now my pawns are horrible, and white is completely winning. So I take on d4, Andre plays queen to h5, which is a good move, maybe not double X slam, but it more or less forces the game to end immediately. So after queen to h5, I play the move h takes g6. We get queen takes g6, king h8, queen h6, king g8, queen g6, king h8, and the game ends in a repetition here. Andre does not really have a choice. If he were to play a move like rook c1, for example, I can go bishop f5, attacking the queen, and after queen h6, bishop h7, suddenly my king is very safe, and I simply have an extra bishop on the board versus this white knight on a4. So, game ends in a draw, a very peaceful draw, but definitely a game that had a lot of fight to it. I was very proud of my g5 move early in the game. Andre found an incredible move, knight to e5, and the game petered out to a draw. So when you have players of this level playing against each other, it's not too uncommon for it to end in a draw. But I felt like I had my chances, and my opponent was up to the task. So that is the first game we're going to take a look at. But there were some other exciting games going on today. Now, also a half point below me, there were two rising juniors who were playing. There was Sam Sevian from the United States of America and Javokir, I don't know how you pronounce, so no offense to all those Beckies, Sindarov. Now, Sindarov is a player who's been rising really quickly. He's gained about 25 to 30 points over the last month and a half or so. I actually played him in the Doha Qatar Masters, where we drew in the middle of the tournament. So, big game, Sevian plays c4, we get g6 here, we get e4, and now this move e5 is played. Now after e5, we get knight to f3, bishop g7, and now we have d4, takes, and it's kind of funny because it's actually almost an accelerated dragon, except the pawn is on c7 instead of e7. So if we compare this, just to show you guys what I mean by that, say if you get the regular Sicilian dragon, this would be the regular Sicilian dragon. So when we contrast this to this position, the difference is that the pawn is on e7 versus c7, but it's still kind of similar because white is trying to build the Maroczy setup with the pawns on these two squares. So we get knight to f6, knight c3 played by Sevian, castles, bishop to e3, and now we get c6 from Sindarov, trying to play d5 and contest the center immediately here. Sevian plays queen d2, We get rook to e8, pressuring the pawn on e4 twice with the knight and the rook. We get f3 guarding the pawn. And now Sindarov strikes in the center with the move d5. And here Sevian decides to trade with the e pawn on d5. We get cd5, and now he decides to castle. Sindarov plays the move knight to c6, and black is already a little bit better here because it's very similar to a Sicilian dragon, except his pawn is on c4 instead of c2. And even better for black is that also his rook on e8 is on an open file. In the normal dragon line, just to show you guys how you get like some kind of dragon, I guess. I'm trying to set up a random position. I guess it's wrong. Let me do this the proper way. If you were to get some normal dragon, for example, where white castles queenside, so you got some position like this, you'll notice the pawn is on e7, so the rook on e8 doesn't do anything on the e file. But in the game here, when we get to this position, the rook is on an open file. White has pushed the pawn to c4 instead of the pawn being on c2. And for that reason, white is already in a lot of trouble, potentially. So Sevian decides to trade the knights on c6, and now he plays the move bishop to d4, trying to blunt the power of the dragon bishop on g7. Sindarov plays rook b8, using this open file and spying the pawn on b2. We get c takes d5, and now an excellent move, which is pawn to c5, sacrificing a second pawn here. Now, the reason Sindarov plays c5 is he's banking that once white takes on c5, he can go queen to a5, hitting the bishop, and now there are all these massive threats on the queen side, and most importantly, this dragon bishop is very much alive here. So, we get the move bishop to d6 played by Sevian. Already here, it's very hard to play. Computer wants bishop d4, but after rook to b4, lining up all kinds of fossils, it's very, very scary to play. So we get bishop d6, and now Sindarov plays bishop to f5. Now, this is not a double question mark blunder. It's simply not the best move, because rook to b7 here would actually be completely winning. But bishop f5 is a great idea anyway. Black sacks the rook on b8, and he's playing for all the activity with the two bishops and the queen, and he figures with the rook on b8, the power is too great. So we get g4 played here by Sevian. Now, if Sevian were to take on b8, computer says after rook takes b8, maybe white can still play bishop c4 here, trying to defend. But after queen b4, bishop b3, and rook c8, it's very, very dangerous. One sample line is, say, you play a random move like h4 to attack. Black can go knight takes d5, sacking the knight. And look at black's forces. They're just crashing through completely on the c file where the white monarch resides. So, Sevian plays g4 here, desperately trying to kick this bishop off this diagonal. And now Sindarov plays rook b8, ignoring the bishop on f5 altogether and going right in for the kill on the c file. Sevian plays g takes f5, and now we get knight takes d5, sacrificing a second piece. So Sindarov has already sacrificed two pawns, a bishop, and now he offers a knight as well. And the big problem for Sevian here is that he's got this rook on h1 and bishop on f1 that are just not in the game. So Sevian plays f takes g6, we get h takes g6, and now bishop h3 is played. Now, already here the position is objectively resignable, but you can't really resign. You want to see if your opponent can follow through. So we have bishop to h3, and now Sindarov plays knight takes knight on c3. We get bishop takes rook, and Sindarov takes back. So now Sindarov has sacrificed a rook, a bishop, a knight, a couple of pawns. But white is completely lost here simply because the king is under too much pressure here, and the king has no safety whatsoever. So we get queen d3 from Sevian. Sindarov takes the pawn on a2 with the queen. We get bishop to c7, and after this move, knight takes rook on d1. Sam Sevian resigns after 23 moves with the white pieces. An absolute amazing demolishing victory from Sindarov in this game. Just something that feels like it's out of the romantic era of chess. With this win, Sindarov actually moves into the top group of the players who are tied for the lead with 4.5 points out of 6. So I thought I would go over this game just briefly because I thought it was a really exciting game. Just an absolute crushing victory for one side. A game that's very reminiscent of a different time in the world of chess. So, on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from round number 6 of the Grand Swiss being held here in the Isle of Man. I do apologize if my recap is a little bit later than usual, but there is a rest day tomorrow, so I did decide to go out, eat a nice dinner, and relax and enjoy myself. So once again, apologies that the recap is a little bit late, but I hope you have enjoyed the recap. Make sure to smash that subscribe button below if you haven't already. And I will probably be playing Title Tuesday and streaming tomorrow. On Wednesday, I will be back with a recap after the 7th round of the Grand Swiss tournament.